Good morning, LinkedIn Live, Facebook, Twitch, Periscope, and all the places that I'm streaming. Of course, how can I forget YouTube? Uh, my name is Frank Lavinia, and today I'm going to record live another episode of Impact Quantum. So in order to make my life easier in editing, I'm going to roll the intro video for that. But first, I want to thank you for tuning into the stream either live or pre-recorded. As always, I do try to answer the comments and questions as they come in. If not, I go back and monitor that. So without further ado, here comes the dubstep intro for Impact Quantum. In case you didn't know, Impact Quantum is a podcast that Andy and I have kind of spun off to talk about the emerging field of quantum computing and its impact on our world. All right. Let me kick that off. Hello, and that dubstep intro can mean only one thing. This is Impact Quantum, the podcast where we explore the emerging field of quantum computing and the impact that it's going to have on the world, our careers, and pretty much everything else in between. My name is Frank Lavinia. I am a quantum computing enthusiast and podcaster, blogger, etc., etc. You can check me out at franksworld.com. You can also check out our other podcast about data science and AI at datadriven.tv. So this past weekend, my wife and I went over to a friend's house, which I know, right? Like in actual close physical proximity with other human beings. Such a treat that is for the year 2020. And I was telling him about quantum computing, and he's in technology, and he has a very impressive home network setup, by the way. If I can convince him to get on the show and talk about that, either data driven or somewhere else, but it definitely is a network architecture that is worthy of YouTube. Certainly more interesting to me anyway than some of the stuff that I've seen other home network setups. And definitely an inspiration for aspiration. But of course, he's a professional network engineer, and going to have him over to the house someday soon. He can audit what I've built with my knowledge. But this isn't not to get sidetracked, but we were kind of talking about quantum computers, and he had said something that I don't think he's like, well, I don't really know what the use case is for quantum computers. And you're right, you know, the not to, you know, kind of poke fun at that, but I mean, it is a definitely not the type of computing. I don't choose my words carefully because I don't want to tick him off. But ultimately, what this is what quantum computing is high performance compute, no doubt. Like you're probably not going to see a quantum iPhone anytime soon. And I don't think that is really going to happen. If it does happen, it's going to be some time away. But ultimately, what are the applications for quantum computing? Now, he did bring up kind of the canonical example of, you know, breaking primes or breaking encryption. And since this is only a one Schrodinger show in terms of level of difficulty, ultimately one of the thing that always comes up with quantum computing is inevitably is the mention of how it's going to ruin encryption or break encryption as we know it. That's kind of true. It's definitely true if you use anything based on factoring primes. So without getting too much into the math, it turns out that the encryption as we know it today, you know, whether it's, you know, government secrets going back and forth, whether it's, you know, you putting in your credit card number on Amazon or, you know, just surfing the web and you see that HTTPS, behind that is this notion of public key cryptography, or kind of ultimately it's based around that it's multiplying large prime numbers. What makes it secure is that it's easy to multiply two prime numbers together to get a really large number. But what the challenge comes in is, how do you figure out what those two numbers are based on a really long number? That takes a lot of compute. It takes hundreds, thousands of years of compute to kind of break that type of encryption. Quantum computing has the ability to turn that from millennia, centuries, down to minutes. That is probably the most obvious example. Now, that having been said, let's take a look at this here, this quote. And I kind of compared that statement that, there's not a lot of use for quantum computers, at least not yet, to this statement here, where, their chairman of IBM, I think the founder, let me switch this back. The chairman of IBM, president of IBM, Thomas Watson, basically said, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. Obviously, that did not come true. And my kind of thesis here is that it's not that quantum computing won't have applications beyond encryption and a handful of other things I'm doing here. I'm saying we can't predict. You can't go back. He said that in 1943. In 1943, the world was a very different place in a number of ways. And can you go back in time and explain to someone in 1943, even an industry expert, the iPhone, the iPad, right? All of these things were all innovations that were not foreseen. And over time, the advances kind of led to new advances and new markets and new everything. And turns out, and I'll say it again, I've said it before, predicting the future is hard, right? You don't have to sell me on that. I can't find my book, but I wrote a book on Silverlight. I thought this phone here would be the future. Now, in some ways, it was, and if you're listening to this on a podcast, is a Windows phone made, I forget who made this. It's might have been a Kyocera. But this is the Singular 8125, slide-out keyboard, ran Windows Mobile 5, touchscreen, had a camera, and had a stylus too. It can also make phone calls. But this was, I think, circa 2005, 2006, cutting edge. The iPhone is very much, you can kind of draw a straight line between these two, right? In terms of the technology and kind of the experience. But clearly, this form factor never caught on. We now have something that looks more like this. Larger screen, no keyboard. The keyboard's on screen. And, obviously, cameras are better. The technology's better. Everything about this is, better. So to go from this to this was a big leap. So I can cut Mr. Watson a little bit of slack for not seeing the future. In fact, Bill Gates even said something like that 640K of RAM ought to be enough for anyone. Obviously, that prediction did not come true. So as you learn quantum computing, you think, well, there's not really going to be a lot of applications to this. I would say, au contraire, I think that there's definitely going to be applications which we can't even envision yet. I mean, could you imagine going back to 2005 with this type of phone device and thinking that you would be able to hail a cab with this, right? Order food, have stuff delivered, shop, right? It was a very painful experience on this. So all of these innovations, whether that's speed, whether that's convenience, are all things that, were not possible in the first iteration. And you can tell I'm recording this live because my dog is barking. But let me go back and kind of talk about what I wanted to talk about in terms of what other applications are, because he's an industry executive guy. He's super smart, and he didn't know about this, right? Climate change, energy production, right, and food production. Those are all kind of related, at least in my mind. That quantum computers could help with material science, whether that's finding out how the nitrogen cycle works in plants in agriculture, which right off the bat, if that problem is solved, we figure out we can reduce our energy usage, because I think about 30% or so of all energy production in the world is done towards creating fertilizer or doing basically what seedlings and plants can do kind of naturally, the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen fixation. Not a botanist, but that's kind of the thing. Fortunately, we have Wikipedia. Climate change, I think, also would tie into that. And if you can suddenly free up 30% of the world's energy resources, that would have an impact on energy production and climate. But also, I mean, if you take a look at plants, plants have the ability to produce, to take carbon out of the atmosphere, water and solar power, basically photons, and take that out of the atmosphere and convert that to energy. So that, I think, also called photosynthesis. You probably remember that from middle school science and all the science classes you've taken. Obviously, there's a lot of chemistry there, but because there's a lot of chemistry there, this quantum computers can help us figure out how can plants do it so efficiently. And it's probably about twice as efficient as the solar panels that you can buy today. So we can get more efficient solar panels. The slide deck here says antibiotic resistance, but I would say medicine, pharmaceuticals in general. You can have the ability to simulate molecules and how that would affect biology. I've read somewhere that lithium, which is often given as a prescribed as a tool, not a tool, but it's a medicine for folks with certain types of depression and certain types of mental health issues. It somehow, and this was a medical professor saying, it somehow affects the brain in a way we really can't explain, which is fascinating because lithium's been doled out as a medicine for quite some time, and we can't really explain at a molecular level how it affects the brain. That's something that quantum computing can fix, right? If you ever watch these medicine commercials, right, on TV or in between videos on YouTube, they'll say this medicine does this, but there's these side effects, and that gives pharmaceutical makers, a quantum computer would give them the ability to kind of simulate that and maybe craft molecules that don't do that, craft medicines that won't have those nasty side effects, or at least mitigate them. So I would say, too late for Christmas time, but yes, Virginia, there are plenty of applications for quantum computing, and plus dozens, maybe hundreds, that we just can't envision yet, because predicting the future is hard. So if you are on the fence about whether or not you should learn quantum computing, I suggest you do a couple things. One, take a look around. Take a look at the hype around it, right? And take some of the hype with a grain of salt. But also dig behind the hype, right? One of the things I first heard about quantum computing a few years ago, and I was like, okay, that it could solve world hunger. Like, okay, sure. And then when I kind of double clicked on that, so to speak, I found out about the nitrogen fixation, nitrogen cycle, and how much energy is actually used to produce, fertilizer for plants, and how easy, seeds can do it. So there is, hype is kind of like smoke. Where there's smoke, there's probably some kind of fire. Question is, how much and how big. So I would say there are very clear uses here, and not on this slide, but if you're listening to the podcast, you don't care about the slide. Material science. How could you make, rocket ship engines or make rocket engines out of stuff that's more durable? that can survive in more extreme environments? How could you make things more efficiently? And I think also quantum computers can also solve kind of these optimization problems that, if you're familiar with any kind of artificial intelligence or deep learning training, this type of finding the global minimum across an entire sweep of hyperparameters, which is I know this is only one Schrodinger, but ultimately quantum computers can find the best, optimized configuration across a wide array of input data. So I think that, even if we just do, even if there's only 2 applications, this alone can explode into 100 different directions. And the material science aspect of this, I think, also has implications. And I have comments. So these are very specific use cases. You're absolutely right. Not everyone is going to want to model nitrogen molecules. Not everyone is going to model lithium ions for creating medicines. But I want to kind of show what Andy said, my wonderful co-host at datadriven.tv, who's also doing a lot of live streaming too. He says it best. We can't yet imagine the things we're able to accomplish with the help of quantum computers. When Thomas Watson said there's only a market for 4 or 5 computers, keep in mind, this is pre-transistor, right? So we're talking about vacuum tubes. We're talking about, probably this was during World War II, so most of the world's computers were focused on cracking encryption, the Enigma machine and stuff like that. But the transistor and the ability to get if you've ever seen a vacuum tube, my dad used to work as a TV repairman, so he would fix a lot of old TVs, and they had vacuum tubes. But over time, those vacuum tubes were replaced. And if you've never seen them, they're like small light bulbs. They run hot. They have a finite, in terms of what their ability to do is, and they always had to be a certain size, right? They were always, smallest one I've ever seen is about that big, and the size on the vacuum tube determined a lot of things. Don't pretend to be an expert on vacuum tubes. But the transistor basically took that to a smaller and smaller form factor, right? To the point where transistors now are, you need an electron microscope to see them, right? They're we're talking about width of atoms, that is how small these things are. I don't think anyone in the 1940s could have predicted that, except maybe some science fiction authors. And even then, that probably would have seemed far-fetched too. So I agree 100% with Andy that we just don't know, right? When Thomas Watson said that, when Bill Gates said about 640K of memory, well, we couldn't imagine the video games, the sheer number of data that we're generating now. We don't know what we don't know. Predicting the future is hard. So I would say that, yes, it does look like that these are very specific use cases today. But I will say these are big use cases, whether that's producing more efficient solar panels, whether that is finding ways to feed people in a more energy efficient way, medicine, pharmaceuticals, material science. I think those are 4 categories. Those are pretty big specific use cases that impact our daily lives. So even if we stay at this level, it's still going to have a huge impact. And obviously, in terms of solving optimizations, does P equal NP type problems, traveling salesman, traveling salesperson, if you prefer, those types of problems, if we can solve those, are going to have a massive impact on the world. Plus the stuff we can't even see. So I would say bet on quantum computers. My name is Frank Lavinia, and you have been listening to Impact Quantum. You have a great day.